ဧည့်သည်တော်ကြီးများရှင်ဆွေးနွေးပွဲပြန်လည်ကျင်းပတော့မှာဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်နေရာပြန်လည်ယူပေးကြပါရှင်ဆွေးနွေးမြန်းချက်များကိုပြောကြားတဲ့နေရာမှာလည်းမြန်မာဘာသာစကားနဲ့လည်းပါဝင်ဆွေးနွေးနိုင်ပါတယ်ရှင်ကျမတို့ရဲ့ဆွေးနွေးပွဲပြီးဆုံးမှာက translator ဆက်များကိုပြန်လည်အနံပေးရန်လည်းကြိုတင်အသိပေးကြေညာအပ်ပါတယ်ရှင်
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the discussion session will commence in a very few minutes, so may I request all distinguished guests to be seated at your respective seat, please. I would like to request all distinguished guests here, so please return your translation devices before you left the hotel in the evening.
ဧည့်သည်တော်ကြီးများရှင်ဆွေးနွေးပွဲအစီအစဉ်မကြာခင်မှာပြန်လည်စတင်မှာဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်နေရာယူပေးကြပါရန်လေးစားစွာပန်ကြားအပ်ပါတယ်ရှင်
ကျမတို့ရဲ့ယနေ့ဆွေးနွေးပွဲကို MRTV Facebook ကနေပြီးတော့ကျမတို့ live တင်ဆက်နေပါတယ်။သို့ပါ၍တနိုင်ငံလုံးမှာရှိတဲ့ပြည်သူတွေအားလုံးယနေ့ဆွေးနွေးပွဲမှာဆွေးနွေးတဲ့အကြောင်းအရာတွေကိုသိရှိဖို့အတွက်ကိုအများစုဗမာလိုပဲဆွေးနွေးပေးဖို့လည်းကျမတို့ပန်ကြားအပ်ပါတယ်။ So welcome back again to the second afternoon session of the Forum on Myanmar Democratic Transition. So at the afternoon session, we have two individual presentations and one panel discussion, like morning session. So for the individual presentation, we have two speakers. The first speaker is Lieutenant General Retired August Wijojo, who is also a governor at National Resilience Institute, Indonesia. And the second speaker is Professor Dr. Ariel Christian, Professor of Political Science, Institute of Political Science, Helmholtz University from Germany. So I would like to invite both speakers to come up on the stage, please. So before their presentation, I would like to introduce the speakers of today's session. The first speaker is Lieutenant General Retired August Wijojo, who is graduated from Indonesian Armed Forces Academy in 1970. He retired from active duty in 2003, and his two last active duties assignments before the retirement were Chief of Staff of Territorial Affairs of the Indonesian National Armed Forces Commanding General and Deputy Speaker in the National Consultative Assembly, representing the military and national police faction. His works during his appointment as Chief of Staff for Territorial Affairs were closely related to the democratization process and military reform in Indonesia in 1998 until 2004. And he holds master's degree in military art and science from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, National Security from U.S. National Defense University, and Public Administration from George Washington University. He was a deputy in the Presidential Delivery Unit. He was also a commissioner in the Commission of Truth and Friendship Indonesia, Timor-Leste. He currently sits as governor at the National Resilient Institute of Republic of Indonesia and also a member of the advisory board at Institute for Peace and Democracy in Bali. He is also a chairman at Indonesia's Smart Mnet Foundation, which oversees the School of Government and Public Policy, and also a member of advisory board of the Partnership for Governance Reform and senior fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies of Jakarta. His research interests are in the field of security sector reform, democratization process, and post-conflict reconciliation. The second speaker I would like to introduce is Professor Dr. Ariel Croissants. Dr. Ariel has a doctorate degree in political science from Mainz University from Germany. And he served as an assistant professor for comparative politics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And he is also a full professor of political science at the Institute of Political Science in Germany. He is also a co-editor of the journal of the book series Democratization Special Issue Series, and also Politics in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and World Region in Transition. He is on the editorial board of the Asian Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Contemporary Southeast Asian Affairs. So I would like to request the first speaker, Lieutenant General Retired August Wijojo, your presentation, please.
This is forward, back,
Okay.
and the pointer.
Okay, good. Yes, very good afternoon to a distinguished audience, the Minister of Information, and ladies and gentlemen, which I cannot state one by one, but you are all distinguished. First of all, I would like to convey my thanks for inviting me, not only that I could be able to contribute to this very important conference, but also to have the trust in me that I can contribute to this important conference. I think between me and the professor makes the ideal pair, because I can present the empiric information of the Indonesian experience in transitioning from military to civilian government, and I think the professor is now ready also to give you the full intensive theoretical framework for the subject. First of all, like the previous speakers in the morning, I would say that there is no one-size-fits-all for this, and that each context is different. I shall be explaining the Indonesian context, And if I mention anything about Myanmar, it is only that I'm trying to compare because of some cases, Myanmar is better off than Indonesia. And in other cases, there are aspects which poses challenges to Myanmar. But of course, at the end of the day, it is only the Myanmar people who knows best about their land, about their peoples, about their country, and about their challenges. And the decision to opt of what is best for the Myanmar people will always rest with the Myanmar people and only to the Myanmar people and nobody else. I will start from the point that there are too many things in common between Myanmar and Indonesia. First is that the history of Indonesia and also the process of the position of the military coming from history and what it came to be in the modern times. To understand where we are, we have to understand three aspects, to my opinion. One is that we understand the Constitution as a point of reference of how things should be done, of how things should be arranged. But secondly, if there are anything that are not up to of what we expected, then we have to know where it came from. So with that, we have to understand the history of the country, the history of the institution. For instance, in this case of military government, we have to understand where the military came from and how they came to power and why they came to power. And thirdly is that if in the Indonesian case, we think that the democratization process is not a linear process, it's not a fast progress, it is more of a muddling through. And if we try to understand why is that, then we have to understand things that are embedded in the process. With that, I mean in the society, we have to understand the culture of the society. Why are changes so difficult in a society? We have to understand the culture. And if we are talking about the political transition from military to civilian government, in the end, essentially, we are talking about civil-military relations. How the military got hold of the political authorities, extending beyond the traditional military roles of national defense. And national defense in the traditional military role means external defense. The main mission for the military is war-fighting missions. And what is the end state of a military reform that Indonesia intended to achieve? Okay, I will start with the background of the history of Indonesia. The Indonesian military was formed or incepted from several institutions during the struggle for independence. One, there were former Dutch East Indies soldiers. Secondly, there were former also soldiers of what we call the defenders of the motherland, created by the Japanese. Third, it was formed from the various freedom fighters unit. And the freedom fighters unit are essentially the armed wing of the political movement for independence. If movement for independence we can consider as a political movement, then it would be political in nature. They have this military wing, so that with that we can also assume that these military wings are also political in nature. So right from the beginning, the Indonesian military was already heavily involved in politics. Assembling or making into one national military, but also in the struggle to defend itself from the politicization of the various political parties during the early days of independence. Yes. Now, why does Indonesia have to be democratized? First of all, is that the resignation of President Suharto on the 21st of May 1998 with the advent of democracy and marking the end of the administration of the Founding Fathers generation. What I mean to say is that Indonesia saw the coming of democracy, and the arrangement until the President Suharto's regime or administration was actually a regime conducted by that generation of those who were involved in the struggle for independence. So it was heavily colored by a sort of camaraderie, comrade in armship, when they were fighting during the struggle for independence. General Suharto was the last figure of that generation. So with that, Indonesia have to decide, how can we succeed or replace, or can we continue with that arrangement? And now with the civilian politicians in place, I do not know all those civilian politicians. They come, or they are results of civilian modern education from universities. I don't know them. But during this first Founding Fathers generation, they knew each other, and they can connect one to the other. So when we have a saying that anything can be arranged, that is actually not necessarily untrue. To a certain extent, that was true. So the reform to democracy was actually the answer that we have, that the Indonesian people have to provide when it came to the end of the political system, specifically designed for those first generation of Founding Fathers. Then we amended the 1945 Constitution. We thought that the soul of the state and the people was contained in the preamble. So we decided that the preamble cannot be changed. If we change the preamble, and which contained Pancasila, that means that we change the basic philosophy of the country, and that we change the country. We have the National Assembly. The president in the past used to be elected in the National Assembly. Next, with the amendment, direct elections of president, governors, and heads of executive powers at regency and mayor of city level, and members of House of Representatives and regional representative legislative bodies are all directly elected by the people. What are new in the amended constitution? It mandated for the establishment of a regional representative body. Secondly, the president can only be re-elected once after his first term. In the old constitution, the president could endlessly be a candidate in the presidential election. But in the amended constitution, the president can only serve for 2 terms, 2 consecutive terms. Third, powers are granted to regional government as regional autonomy, the establishment of a new constitutional court, add section 10A on human rights, and the establishment of an anti-corruption body. So why do we have to amend the constitution, as I've said? I should have mentioned this first, that first of all, that there is no limit to presidential term of office, limited regional autonomy, and too many appointed representatives, making the legislative only a rubber stamp for executive policies. And we did also have the military representation in the parliament. That enforced the role of the legislative as rubber stamp for the presidential policies. Fourth, it is executive heavy by design or implementation. And fifth, the government party holds an overwhelming majority, so that policies can be assumed will always pass the legislative body. The president was elected by the National Assembly. Here I want to tell you that one of the unique characteristics of the Indonesian democratization process and TNI reform, or the change from military to civilian government, is that the military reform preceded the political reform. The military reform was actually self-initiated by the military. This is unique, and I don't think that there are any similar situation in other countries, because I don't believe that change can be brought by external forces. The best change can only be done by its own wishes from internal forces. We see that right from the beginning, we have already seen the military reform, and it was not until 1999 that we saw the constitutional reform, which ended in 2002. It was not until 2004 that we saw the implementation of the result of the amendment of the Constitution, which was actually the start of the political reform, whereas the military reform have already started way in 1998. So things that made easier in Indonesia is that military reform was initiated by the military itself and was a self-initiated reform, only followed by the political reform. If I say TNI, it is the abbreviation for the Indonesian military. Characteristics of the Indonesian military reform is that it was initiated from within the military itself. Implementation precedes constitutional reform. Third, by that, TNI voluntarily terminates the dual function doctrine, which mandated that the Indonesian military exists as two power. It is a defense and security force, but it is also a socio-political force. That ended with the TNI reform. The TNI and its role as socio-political force, ending its partisan support for the government party. So the Indonesian military shifted from the political supporter of the government party into a professional modern military undertaking or conducting the traditional military role of national defense. That was not easy. And last is the separation of the national police from the armed forces. So what is the end state of that Indonesia wanted to achieve in its military reform? We can say that the end state of the Indonesian military reform is the objective civilian control of the military by the political authorities. What are they? They are that the military will be subordinated to the political authorities. The military can only be used or can only be employed by the political decision of the political authority. The political authority has the responsibility to support with sufficient budget so that the military can carry out its programs to build up a professional military in the role of national defense. From the side of the military, the military would be put under civil supremacy. The military cannot make political decisions, as may have been in the past. Why? Because the military commander of any state or any country is never elected by the people. So the military never holds any political mandate. The military cannot make a political decision. What is the strategic value of the TNI reform? It is to support the democratization process in Indonesia. This is to say that the TNI did not have any involvement at all in the democratization process in Indonesia. It was left totally up to the civilian politicians for the democratic reform. Democratization in Indonesia was a political process with no intervention at all from the military. What are the challenges of the reform? Inexperienced civilian political authorities. I think Indonesia is like Myanmar. We are unfortunate, whereas the ideal situation would be that if we would like to reform the military, we should have an effective civilian political authority to reform the military. But for Indonesia and Myanmar, the reform of the political authority and the military starts at the same time. So who is overseeing these changes? So that the military has nobody to oversee their changes. So it was a simultaneous reform, which was unfortunate. Second, failure in democracy, self-interest, weak political parties. This is what we are seeing in Indonesia. And mind you that democratization process in Indonesia has not been completed, far from being finished. Invitation to military to re-enter politics by civilian politicians. Why? The civilian politicians did not have sufficient practice to practice their political power in the past. They were always overshadowed by the military. So when time came, when they were mandated with the political power, they feel inconfidence. They feel that although that they have won the votes from the people to hold political power, that is not enough. They think that until they have the political support of the military, they do not have enough support for their political power. Next is the mindset of the military as the sole guardian of the national unity. Remember that the military was made up of former freedom fighters unit. So during that guerrilla days, it was part of the characteristics of the guerrilla warfare that the guerrilla fighters and the people are like fish and water. And that grew into the self-perception of the military that they are the sole guardian of national unity and they have the monopoly of the oneness between the soldiers and the people. Political attractions for the TNI leadership. Whereas during the dual function, a military commander, after they retire or even still in active duty, can be assigned and can be appointed to political positions, to be regional head, to be ministers, to be ambassadors. This stopped with the TNI reform. So this causes a sort of an uneasiness for TNI leadership of where to go next after I retire. So it created some political attractions, and they tried to associate themselves with the various political organization. Next is the perception of democracy as an ineffective form of governance. This is not only to the military, but also to the people. They always try to compare of what they see, what they feel now, with what they see and what they feel in the past, during the authoritarian regime. And they felt that the authoritarian regime have made more certainties to them compared to the current democratic government. And we all know, we heard why, how how democracy is messy. Yes. In fact, we cannot blame with democracy, but it is that there are some misexpectations of the people, of the public, towards democracy, and that created the wrong perception. What role did the military play in the transition into democracy? The NISF initiated reform. Okay, we have discussed about this. If I'm asked, what did the military play in the transition into democracy? Maximum. What is maximum? Minimum intervention by the military into the transition into democracy. By nothing involving themselves into the democratic transition, that is the maximum contribution by the military in the transition into democracy. During this transition, remember that we had representatives in the parliament. How did they play their role? They have prepared themselves into their future role when they do not have any political role. So what did they do? Mostly they played and they cast and not siding with any political parties. I forgot the word, the political word for it. So that is the way in their preparation to pull out from the parliament. What were the greatest challenges during Indonesia's democratic transition from the eyes of the armed forces? The military and political reforms took place simultaneously, with no institution left to play the role of overseeing reforms. This is just to tell you there is a certain culture of the military and how to understand that certain culture. And it won't be advantageous if we continuously play an antagonistic position towards the military, and the military also plays an antagonistic position towards the civilians. That would not contribute anything to the democratic transition. The challenge would be, how do we build what the term that has been cited many times, whole of government approach. We can talk about economic policy, we can talk about social policy, but whose policy is it? If there is a difference between the military policy in Myanmar and the civilian political authorities in Myanmar, then that won't be any use. So the first priority would be how to build that whole of government approach between all national elements. How does the political elements agree as to what Myanmar is and what does Myanmar want? Okay. As a spillover of past arrangement and political culture, there is a tendency of the civilian political authorities to seek political support from the military. This is the opposite. Third, military reform was not conducted in gradual sequence. Moreover, due to limited time, the policy implementation and challenges from changing political environment created the need for multiple responses and in a learning by doing situation. So it was never planned. The Indonesian democratic transition was never planned, except for the amendment that was systematically, although not to the best form that we would like to see. But the military reform was never planned. There was no plan for the military reform. What is the current support? There are some attentions to be directed to some unfinished issues or situations which can lead to relapse of the democratization process. One is the tendency of the public lingering past situations when the military held non-military functions, creating the image of a more decisive, stable and effective government, of an authoritarian government supported by the military. Second, the military can still not leave the memories of the glories of the past with its perceived role of the guardian of the nation. They think that only the military can guard the nation. Third, some civilian political authorities still tend to seek the political support of the military. The security sector support has been relatively consistent, although in some cases may cause fluctuations. How should the security sector contribute to sustaining democracy? Opening access to comparative studies of professional militaries in established democracies. by providing the military opportunities to attend professional military education and participate in combined international exercise or operations. One other thing is policy-making process. Democratic transition does not exist in a normal situation. The military has been pushed to the side. So there are still some spillovers for them in their mindset, in their psyche. And when civilian political authorities, by way of winning the election, come to power, this needs some mendings, yeah? Mending the broken gates. Yeah? In the theory, in various Latin American countries' cases of security sector reform, there is that case of how do you compensate? How do you compensate the military? As though that military, get out of politics. I will compensate you with the budget. Military, get out of politics, but I will compensate you with the budget to enhance soldiers' prosperity. So there are special things that we should think about and to be addressed to the military, because this is not a normal situation. And that will help a lot, again, to build that a national approach. Keys to success of democratic transition: there is a vibrant civil society, has existed way before the start of democratic reform. If democratic reform was, can be said, with the resignation of President Suharto in 1998, vibrant civil society discourses about democracy has started way before 1998. Even for the military, in 1980s, they have thought, although not using the phrase of withdrawing from dual function, but how to enhance military professionalism. Third, the military self-initiated its internal reform, leading to its non-involvement in the democratic transition. Fourth, democratic transition was left as a purely political process. Indonesia did not frame a new constitution, but only making amendments to the original constitution. The amendments retains the basic value of the republic while inserting forward-looking democratic principles. Challenges surrounding the democratic transition: the resignation of President Suharto actually created a strategic surprise. That was why it left a vacuum in the political authorities. And I think Indonesia was lucky to have such a military by not jumping in to occupy that vacant space, but rather to prepare for democracy. The Indonesian military withdrew from its socio-political role. Secondly, no prior plans for transition. Third, the military reform preceded the political reform. Fourth, the military and the political reforms practically was a parallel process through learning by doing. Fifth, no sufficient time in preparing institutional capacity for the new roles. Advantages to Myanmar: transition was the decision of the military authority, full control of the reform. In Indonesia, the transition was marked by the resignation of President Suharto. So Myanmar was in a better situation to start the reform, and that now is still in full control of the reform. In Indonesia, President Suharto was forced to resign. Secondly, conducive situation in handover of power between leaders of government and opposition. We saw this, we are still seeing this in Myanmar. The challenges of Myanmar: the need for an inclusive national ideology or philosophy required for national reconciliation. Myanmar shares land borders with other countries. Indonesia is fortunate, did not have this situation. Myanmar is rather unfortunate to have this situation. Third, Myanmar has been a closed society with lack of resources for transition. Myanmar has delicate security challenges up north, and national reconciliation requires a common forward-looking national vision based on a consensus of a perspective how to deal with the past. Here I wish to inform you where Myanmar was in a position more advantageous compared to Indonesia. But there are also challenges to Myanmar. Preconditions for transition actually is, one, there should be a mutual trust between the civilians and military. Do you have this? In Indonesia, where the military was prepared to withdraw from its socio-political role by its own initiative. Secondly, after that, we directly locked the decision through various legislations. So there is no turning back. We were lucky to have that. Third, a competence of replacing institutions. Indonesia was not so lucky to prepare for this. The police, the civilian government, the regional government, and fourth is supremacy of the law, where I think Myanmar is better off compared to Indonesia. Myanmar, it's a common practice to declare martial law. In Indonesia, we are not familiar with martial law, but every day anybody can employ the military anywhere. So Myanmar is better off here. Subsequent development of transition, trial and error to strike the right balance between rights and responsibilities, and institutional capacity building in democratic arrangements. There are unfinished security situations and the need for national reconciliation. What we have here, this is the conclusion, but I will conclude with my comments. One is that it would be best if the first step would be able to reach a national reconciliation. This is not easy, this is difficult. Even Indonesia have not prepared the ground for reconciliation. The society is not ready for reconciliation, even in Indonesia. But it would be best. From here on, if there was a reconciliation, then we would say we draw a new line. Okay? We have made peace with the past. This is the new situation. So let's start. Secondly is that trust building, to have a national outlook. How do you want to see Myanmar in 25, 50 years to come, with the situation in a geopolitical position like the current one, with the demographic situation like the current one? How do you want to see to live together in the similar geographical situation? Next is that this is not a normal situation. We should stop to hold and to retain any an antagonistic position. We should clear our minds from any thoughts on revenge. And next would be also capacity building for civilian politicians. The power now is in the hands of civilians, 100%. Before the military can have excuses that they have dissatisfaction with the civilians should show that the military should not worry. The country, the people is in good hands. Show that the civilians are capable and have the capacity to administer and to manage the situation. Next is, how do you manage political parties? Indonesia is still also struggling to see this. So in sharing experiences, I don't think it's only about security sector reform. I don't think it's only about democratization, but also how to manage political parties. And if you are interested to come to Indonesia, maybe I can give you some hints to which political parties that you can go to, and don't go to the wrong political parties. Yes, everything, all effort should be dedicated to build that what Dr. Fiatikotis said, to have that whole of government approach. If there is a policy, if there is a national policy, then it will be a national policy of the government, including the military. How do you build this? I think you know best. That concludes my presentation, and I look forward to discussion and question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Retired August Wee-Cho-cho, for your interesting presentation. We will provide question and answer session after the Professor Dr. Oriel Crescent's presentation. So may I invite Professor for your presentation, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'd like to begin my talk with 3 observations. The first one is that in the past 4 decades or so, the world has seen numerous transitions from non-democratic rule to democracy. According to data from the Washington-based Freedom House Institute, the number of democracies increased from 40 in 1973, that is about 27% of all states worldwide, to 115 in 2010, about 60% of all states. Of the total of 89 regime transitions, only 26, that is roughly 28%, occurred as transitions from military government to civilian government. For clarity, in this talk, I mean by military government a political system led by somewhat collegial bodies representing the officer corps in which multiple officers influence decision-making, representing the military institution. So I'm not talking about military strongman regimes like in Indonesia, a president that came from the military but then to some extent civilianized his political rule. I'm talking about military ruling council governments like in Myanmar. A second observation. Democratization in a country is not just about electing new leaders through free and fair and competitive elections. It entails a much more comprehensive political overhaul. Possibly the most significant factor in the success or failure of a state's democratic transition is establishing democratic civil-military relations. And a third observation, challenges of reforming civil-military relations during regime transitions differ between countries and issue dimensions. It is a salient concern, especially in those countries that have a long tradition of military intervention in national politics, such as Myanmar. In addition, the challenge of reforming civil-military relations is more complex than the issue of what's called civilian control over the military. Reforming civil-military relations actually includes not only questions concerning the distribution of decision-making authority, who has the authority to decide policies, it also includes questions of the armed forces' ability to achieve their defined mission, that is effectiveness, and at what costs in lives and resources, that is questions of military efficiency. Because at the end of the day, societies, countries, nations establish a military because they want protection from threats. So civil-military relations is not only about, and civil-military relations reforms is not only about issues of civilian control, it's also about issues of military effectiveness and military efficiency. Transitions from military rule to political democracy since the mid-1970s have often contributed to profound changes in the military's role in politics. For example, the number of military governments decreased from 16 in 1973 to only 2 in 2010. Though the good news from a civilian perspective is military government is an almost extinct species. And the frequency of military-led coup d'etat decreased from an average of 10 per year in the 1970s to fewer than 3 in the 2000s. Thailand is an exception. Thailand does not represent the global trend in civil-military relations. By Thailand is an exception, I mean, of course, the military coups in 2006 and 2014. However, despite their retreat from government to barracks, military leaders in many new democracies in Asia and beyond successfully carved out political niches within their new political orders. Political scientists call this the institutionalization of reserved domains of policy making and the military assertion of tutelary power. Furthermore, the experiences of nations such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Thailand suggest that public discontent with cynical elites, chaotic politics, and controversies surrounding election outcomes provide a window of opportunity for military officers to intervene in the political process. But there are also successful cases of civil-military reform. For example, in South Korea and Indonesia, political civilian elites have been successful in reforming civil-military relations and establishing a stable equilibrium of democratic civil-military relations. I will discuss the experiences of countries around the world that transitioned from military rule to democracy with a particular emphasis on 3 questions or 3 aspects. First, the role of the military in the transition from military to civilian government. Second, the political management of democratic reforms in civil-military relations after the transition from military government to civilian government. And third, challenges of national reconciliation and transitional justice. Let me begin with the first aspect, the role of the military in transitions from military to civilian government. When analyzing transitions from authoritarian rule to political democracy, it is important to keep in mind that such processes involve actually 2 transitions. The first transition, if successful, is one from autocratic governance to the installation of a democratic government. Once a transition from authoritarian rule in a given country has reached this point, a second transition can begin. This second transition is one from democratic government to an effective functioning democratic regime. Obviously, Myanmar has just completed the first transition from non-democratic to democratic government and is now in the process of a second transition from democratic government to democratic regime. There are different modes or forms of transition from military to civilian government. The 2 important ones are the following. First, reform through rupture. This mode of transition from military government to civilian government is characterized by a high degree of confrontation and the dominance of opposition forces over the outcome of the transition. Reform through rupture in military regimes is exceptional. Only 3 of the 26 cases fulfill this scenario. Greece in 1974, Argentina in 1983, and Bangladesh in 1990. The second and much more frequent mode is the reform through extrication, characterized by the dominance of the military government over the transition, or at least the ability of the military government to negotiate the terms of its retreat to the barracks. Typical examples for reform through extrication are Brazil, Thailand, or Myanmar. Typical examples for negotiated transitions from military to civilian rule, one typical example is South Korea. Wherever military cohesion disintegrated because of internal factional conflicts or because of a failed foreign adventure, for example, Argentina in '83, the Falkland disaster, or Greece in 1974 with a failed Cyprus intervention, the military was in a weak position to exert concessions from the civilian opposition and hence exercised little influence over the political outcomes of the transition. In contrast, wherever the military remained cohesive in the defense of the military government, elements of extrication shaped the process of transition. That's been the case in most countries that transitioned from military government to civilian government, for example, Brazil, Chile, South Korea, Thailand, Pakistan. Under such conditions, the short-term outcome of the reform process almost always is a democratically elected government that enjoys little or no control over the armed forces, whereas the military is able to exercise tutelage over the democratic process. For example, in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, or South Korea, military reserve domains and military prerogatives were an integral part of the outcome of the transition. These military prerogatives or reserve domains often include one or more than one of the following 5 types of prerogatives. First, and for the participants from Myanmar, this sounds, of course, very familiar to you. First, military-dominated national security councils, like in Brazil or in Turkey. Second, reserved seats for representatives of the military in parliament, like in Chile until 2002, or in Indonesia until 2004. Third, economic autonomy and budgetary autonomy from the government, like in Pakistan. Fourth, military autonomy in its internal affairs, all cases I've just mentioned. And fifth, military control over national defense policy and or matters of internal security, all Latin American and Central American cases. The case of Myanmar, I think, clearly fits the scenario of a military-led transition from military government to civilian government under military control or tutelage. As in most countries in Latin America and Asia, the armed forces have preserved their autonomy and have continued to exercise influence or guidance over the political system. Even though the institutionalization of reserve domains, political prerogatives, and military autonomy in Myanmar after 2010 is a typical outcome of transition through extrication, what is exceptional is the intensity, the breadth of reserve domains and political prerogatives in Myanmar. Why did civilian governments in Latin America, Asia, or Africa consent to military tutelage that restricted the possible range of democratic outcomes? There are 3 explanations. One obvious explanation or answer is that civilian reformers feared that any attempt to impose civilian control, as demanded by more radical elements in the opposition movement, would have immediately provoked exactly what it was intended to eliminate: military intervention. So one explanation is fear, worry. A second one is that in many countries with a long tradition of military intervention in national politics, such as Thailand, South Korea, and Pakistan, institutional models through which civilians could have exercised control of the military were simply absent at the time of the transition from military to civilian government. Without such institutions, the choice faced by democratic governments may have been one of either tolerating military autonomy or destroying the military altogether. And third, the issue of civilian control over the military is not only whether it is prudent to attempt, but also who wants to have civilian control over the military. In this regard, cases such as South Korea in the late 1980s, Chile in the early 1990s, and Thailand in the 2000s are very telling. Some political forces simply proffered military tutelage and autonomy as a protection from demands for greater political participation and economic redistribution. So the complete answer is first, fear of military intervention, second, lack of institutional means, and third, often or sometimes civilian politicians do not really want to have civilian control over the military if they fear that their political opponents could use this control for their own political purposes. Let me now switch to the second question, the role of or how to institutionalize civil military reforms in the second transition from democratic government from democratic government towards an effective democratic regime. The challenge of democratic reformers during the first transition from military to an elected government is to achieve the inauguration of a democratic government without provoking military resistance. The challenge for democratic governments during the second transition from democratic government to an effective democratic regime is to establish democratic governance of civil-military relations. This challenge is, of course, especially acute in countries where the military was able to secure political and institutional privileges for itself during the first transition from military to civilian government. Yet, as we have heard from several speakers today, the conditions created by transitions negotiated with the ancien regime, the old order, are not irreversible. The essential feature of democracy is that nothing is decided definitively. In some countries that suffered, where democracy was limited or constrained by very important and strong military prerogatives, such as South Korea, Brazil, or Chile, these countries experienced civil military reforms that led to democratic civil-military relations, although in all these countries civil military reforms took 5, 10, 15, or 20 years to take place. The difference between these countries like South Korea, Brazil, and Chile on the one hand, or Thailand and Pakistan on the other hand, suggests that the development of civil-military relations in new democracy is affected but not determined by the historical legacies and the initial conditions during and after the transition from military government. In explaining diverging or different outcomes of civil-military reforms during the transition from a democratic government to an effective democratic regime, the scholarly literature, my own research, suggests that 7 factors are important. So there is not a single explanation for the failure or success of democratic reforms in civil-military relations, but there are at least 7 factors which seem to play a role. First, the political legacies of the first transition. As mentioned before, the stronger the military's control over the first transition, the better military leaders are to gain or maintain their prerogatives and stifle post-authoritarian reforms. The mode of transition, however, as I said, is not the only factor affecting democratization. Decisions made ex ante can be changed ex post. So a second factor that influences the possibility and the outcome of civil-military relations reforms is the degree of military cohesion. Militaries are much better able to preserve their spheres of political and institutional autonomy if the military organization is cohesive and not weakened by internal factionalism. Strong internal cohesion, for instance, allowed the Pakistani military to continue its rule by other means beyond the transition to democracy and made possible the 1999 coup d'etat by General Musharraf. A third factor is the degree of civilian cohesion or civilian unity. Several country experiences suggest that civilian cohesion and the acceptance of democratic institutions by political elites is a key factor in the process and a key condition for the successful processes of civil-military reforms. Where civilian elites are unified in the goal of keeping the military out of politics, the institutionalization of civilian control becomes possible. On the other hand, to quote Navasera, former Spanish Minister of Defense, where there is no agreement between political parties that they will not seek the military support for their respective stances, it is extremely difficult to implement reforms for civilian control over the military. A fourth factor is the strength of civil society. Many studies have highlighted the importance of a strongly developed and active civil society for the consolidation of democratic civil-military relations in post-military democracies. As the experiences of many Asian countries suggest, a vibrant civil society strengthens civilians' bargaining leverage vis-à-vis the military. Furthermore, an active civil society provides politicians with additional monitoring of and information about military affairs. A fifth factor is the management of political stability and order. A key to successful reform of civil-military relations is managing political order and stability. For example, in Latin America, the end of the anti-regime wars and the decline of revolutionary movements enabled the military's withdrawal from politics during the first transitions in the 1980s and 1990s. The course of civil-military relations in countries such as South Korea, Greece, Bangladesh, or Ghana also demonstrate that the lack of internal armed conflict contributes in a positive way to the reform of civil-military relations. In contrast, ongoing internal armed conflicts make civilians dependent on the military and thus inhibit the reduction of military prerogatives in internal security and other policy areas. In addition, the inability of elected governments to provide means for peaceful conflict resolution, reconciliation, and the building of an inclusive multinational state might undermine the legitimacy of civilian actors and democratic institutions. A sixth factor is the creation of trust and civil-military reform coalitions. During the early years of democratization in post-authoritarian political settings, the crucial mission for civilians is to convince military leaders that reforms in civil-military relations are in the best interest of the military organization. In order to achieve this, it is necessary to create trust. Civilian leaders must demonstrate their will and ability to commit themselves credibly to military officers, and they should abstain from ill-advised attempts of retributive justice. Civilians need the military to consent to reforms, and militaries will not accept reform policies if civilian elites are not able to convince a sufficiently large number of military officers of the benefits of such reforms and to co-opt them into supporting the civilian reform agenda. More often than not, successful civil-military reforms are achieved together with the military, but not against the military. In this sense, the key to successful civil-military reforms is less about speedy reforms, big bang reforms, than about whether reformists are able to maintain political stability, even though it may delay the completion of the second transition and the advent of full democracy. The seventh and last factor I would like to mention is the strength of the civilian institutional infrastructure, institutions, and the know-how in civil-military relations. In the long term, the success of democratic reforms in civil-military relations seems also to depend on the ability of civil society, political parties, parliaments, and cabinets to establish effective institutions that help to draft good defense and military policies, that reduce the civil-military information asymmetry, and lower the costs of civilian oversight of the security sector. And by the way, here I see especially a role for international organizations or transnational actors like the German Political Party Foundation, who were so nice to pay for my airfare. They can provide help here to construct and to build this civilian infrastructure and civilian know-how. So let me come to the end of my presentation. What can be learned from the experiences of other countries? As we have heard before, and I couldn't agree more, there are many differences between Myanmar and other countries. However, keeping these differences in mind, a first and perhaps the most obvious conclusion is that there is no optimal strategy of reforming civil-military relations after extrication from military rule. The forces pushing for democracy must be prudent before the transition from military government to civilian government, and they would like to be resolute after this transition has taken place. But decisions made during the first transition create conditions that are hard to reverse in the second transition, since they preserve the power of forces associated with the old government. Ex post, the Democrats may regret their prudence, but ex ante, they have no choice but to be prudent. A second conclusion, given the deep entrenchment of the military in the political and economic system, the legacies of military rule and military control over the first transition, and a challenging context such as ongoing ethnic conflicts, civil-military reforms in democratizing Myanmar are much more challenging than in most other countries. This is the most difficult case of civil-military reforms a political scientist like me can think of. It seems therefore plausible to assume that democracy in Myanmar will most probably have to live with military prerogatives, tutelary power, and civil-military power sharing for quite some time to come. A third conclusion, presumably the most crucial prerequisite for building a democratic civil-military relations is ensuring political stability via strong civilian leadership, effective governance, and stable and transparent political institutions. What differentiates successful cases from unsuccessful or failed cases of civil-military reforms is that in the successful cases, pro-democracy reformers were able to build strong leadership and bargaining leverage vis-à-vis the military. And they did so through elite compromise among old elites and new reformers. A fourth conclusion is to favor gradualism over revolutionary change. Slow and sometimes limited democratic transition can bring about a more desirable outcome than revolutionary changes, at least in terms of civil-military relations. Swift and drastic changes are inadvisable because they might unnecessarily provoke the ire of those for whom regime change means the loss of their power and privileges. A gradualist approach that favors coalition building and a willingness to make acceptable compromises is usually a prudent way to proceed. Fifth, and the second last conclusion, civil-military change coalitions are the key. We've heard that before in the presentation about Indonesia. In case of extrication from military governments such as Myanmar, successful reforms can only be achieved together, not against the military. Hence, unilateral reforms are inadvisable. Although this can be a frustrating undertaking, the key for successful military reforms is to create sufficiently broad change coalitions among leaders from political society, civil society, and the military. And sixth and last, pro-democracy reformists are too often impatient and rush into hasty reforms over military and security institutions. In many cases, without a proper understanding of the nature of the military as a national security institution. Moreover, a newly elected leadership that is weak, divided, and engaged in factional fighting often utilizes a purge of military officers as a political tactic to gain popular support. Such a short-sighted and politically motivated purge can backfire among the top military brass and derail the route to democracy. For civilian leadership to remove politicized officers and reform the military organization, the government must already have a strong and stable democratic system. Furthermore, military reform cannot be geared toward punishing officers and weakening security institutions, because the ultimate objective of civil-military reforms in emerging democracies is to build democratic governance in the security sector, but also a strong armed forces that can effectively defend the state and the nation and simultaneously support the norm of civilian supremacy and democracy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Aurel Crosins, for your very comprehensive presentation. Now we have the question and answer session. ကျမတို့အခုအမေးဖြေကဏ္ဍဖြစ်ပါတယ်ရှင်။ဟုတ်ကဲ့မေးခွန်းများမေးလို့ရပါတယ်ရှင်။အလယ်မှာလည်း mic ပေးထားပါတယ်။ဟုတ်ကဲ့စပြီးမေးပေးပါရှင်။ မြန်မာလိုလည်းမေးလို့ရပါတယ်ရှင်။ကျမတို့ direct ဘာသာပြန်ဆက်များရှိပါတယ်။
I would like to ask Lieutenant General Wijojo, you said the Indonesia army reformed itself. Among the reform, I think the most important reform is giving up the political power. Actually, the army controlled the country for so many years, which factors push the army to give up the political power. Thank you.
Okay, ကျွန်မနော်လှဆိုးပါအမျိုးသားလွှတ်တော်ကကိုယ်စားလှယ်တူဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီမှာဥစ္စာပေါ့နော်Lieutenant General August ရဲ့ presentation ထဲမှာသူကဥစ္စာ1945ကနေပြီးတော့2000နှစ်ချက် Okay Okay,
မေးပေးလို့ရပါပြီရှင်
Okay ဒီစီးရင်ဒီဇာတ်လေးမှာပေါ့နော်စိတ်ဝင်စားတာ1945ကနေ2004အထိเนาะသူကဒီ timeline လေးကိုပြထားပါတယ်ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင်စနစ်တကျပေါ့နော်ဒီလိုမျိုး transition ကိုကြိုတင်ပြီးတော့လုပ်ပြီးတော့မှသွားတာလားဒါမှမလို့ရှိရင်ဒီဖြစ်တဲ့ဥစ္စာကို record လုပ်တာလားဆိုတာသိချင်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဥစ္စာပေါ့နော်ဒီ constitution တွေ change တယ်နောက်ဆုံးမှကြာလို့ရှင် law တွေဖြစ်လာတယ်ပေါ့နော်အဲ့ timeline လေးအကြောင်းကိုပို့ပြီးတော့သိချင်ပါတယ်လို့ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
Thank you, especially to both panelists. I would like to briefly comment and ask the General about Indonesia. Thank you for mentioning that the military reform proceeded, or at least went in session with the parallel with the political reform. And you also mentioned about military rule should be minimum rather than maximum. I think the panelist in the previous session was indirectly endorsing the maximum role. I know it's no longer nakedly military regime, but if I can say in Malay, sikit saja, there is some reduction. We are talking only about further reduction, my colleague and I just now. So my point is about the, okay, if I can just compare briefly with the Indonesian and the 3 Burmese constitutions. You did mention about philosophy remain unchanged for more than 70 years. But the unique feature of the 3 Burmese constitutions is that the 1974 constitution attacked in colorful negative terms the 1947 constitution in the preamble. In the 2008 constitution also little bit less critique is made of the 1947 constitution. So this is our unique point. My question now comes to the role of General Suharto. Please excuse my ignorance of Indonesian political history or military history for that matter. You did mention that Suharto did participate. Is he in the very front line? From what I understand, Sukarno and Muhammad Atta were among the front line of the freedom struggle, so to speak. So is he in the second line or in the third line? That is my question. And the second question is about the military presentation. I understand that the military in Indonesia, the 25%, is unlike in Myanmar 2008 constitution, is not in the constitution. It is a practice or a convention. So when did it start and when did it end it? And finally, thank you for the second speaker. I will not comment on it. I agree with what you said, but I will just comment about national reconciliation. National reconciliation is used almost as a cross, so to speak, to deter any criticism, deter any comment even. So I would prefer to be frank. Rather, it's good like motherhood and apple pie. It's very nice to hear about national reconciliation, but I think it would be franker and more open to say we fear or we have constraints regarding military-civilian relations or other matters in that regard. Thank you.
Yes. If I interpret the questions right, is that from the first questioner is that how did the military, or how did we convince the military to withdraw from the socio-political role? Is that right? The second is how is the timeline as depicted in my slides? And the third, where was the position of General Suharto during the struggle for independence? The first is how there was no distinct there was no distinct plan as to how the military or the NI was about to carry out its reform. It was developing naturally, as we want to professionalize our military. We have sent our officers in various countries overseas, and when they come back, they have ideas from where they attended the military courses. And so we had comparative studies. And by the time it was approaching for the democratization process in Indonesia, we, as like in any other military institution, we studied the long-term estimates of what will be happening in 5, 10, 15 years to come. And discourses about democracy were already vibrant in Indonesia, starting way back as in the 1980s. It did not have to wait until President Suharto resigned. Actually, President Suharto also had a timeline for democratizing Indonesia, maybe in his own interpretation. One is that it took too long and was overtaken by events with the demise of the Soviet Union, where the democratization process went global. One. Secondly, this is only speculation, my speculation. If we did go along with this concept, then the succession of the national military leadership would not go far around his circles. But if we see the way that he governs Indonesia, we saw that gradual move or progress towards loosening up his authority. So that also helped the Indonesian society to open up. And actually, when President Suharto took office, he opened up Indonesia. He rejoined the United Nations. If we remember, President Sukarno made Indonesia withdrew from UN membership. President Suharto rejoined the United Nations. President Suharto also repaired the relationship with Malaysia and Singapore, where Indonesia had confrontation. And President Suharto opened up Indonesia with the international community. We sent our young generations to schools all over the world. So I think we had collected various comparisons, and that adds richness as to how the civil society or the public of Indonesia paints the future of Indonesia, although that it was more of a modern painting. But it was a natural flow. It was a natural flow, and all the officers were also passionate about making the TNI more professional. The officers knew that one thing that they cannot mention is that to terminate dual function, except that. That is the difference. The reform between before the resignation of President Suharto and after. Before, it was everything to enhance the professionalization of the military, except terminating the dual function. After President Suharto resigned, then it was everything, including terminating the dual function. And actually also it was, again, as I have said, the coming of the resignation of President Suharto created a strategic surprise for the Indonesian politicians, for the Indonesians as a whole. So when the politicians were trying to think about what political system to replace the new order system under President Suharto, the military had time to think for themselves as to how they would cope with the coming of democracy to Indonesia. That has its advantages. It bypassed the political process. So the push on and pull of the political process was bypassed by the Indonesian military. It also did not involve any politicians in the process. So it was purely an internal professional process, and that we knew when we decided as to where we were going, we knew what we needed to reform the Indonesian military. So I think what contributed most to the Indonesian military reform, one is the study of comparison by sending our officers overseas. And secondly, the vibrant civil society, those who returned after attending professional courses overseas, and we tried to make up as to how, in what direction that we would like to see the professionalization of the military. Now, that, as I've said, it was trial and error. It was a strategic surprise. Practically, TNI made use of that window of opportunity. The reform did not trickle down effect directly into the lower command. Practically, the reform was conducted only at the headquarters level, because as you can imagine, during that time, after President Suharto resigned, in the course of maybe 2004 was the first directly elected president, 1999, 4 years, we had Habibie, we had 3 presidents in the course of 4 years. We had 3 presidents. So it was, we can say it was chaotic politically. And the military made use, and it was tested. It was tested by those new presidents coming purely from the civilians. Like, for instance, one president would say, hey, the military supported Suharto, the president. I am now your president. Why don't you support us? So it created examinations, exams, and tests for the military as to how they positioned themselves in this new situation where they had to professionalize and depoliticize themselves. So I think it's more of a natural flow of a gradual process. Second, the timeline. The timeline that I wanted to show here is the timeline for the reform. Starting first is that the reform when President Suharto resigned, then followed by the conceptual, what the military called the new paradigm one. Paradigm one actually was only a moderation of the socio-political role. It has not yet totally withdrew from the dual function. it has not totally terminated the dual function. Why? Because it was still under the new order. But just to show you that there was a passion for the enhancement of professionalization, it was called the new paradigm only in the meaning of the new paradigm of adjusting the socio-political role in a new modern Indonesian society where the public is getting better educated, aware of their rights. So how should the dual function be practiced in a developing society like that? That was the new paradigm, what we call the new paradigm. The new paradigm too, the second, was the total withdrawal from the dual function, the termination of the dual function. Then after that, it was followed by the various legislation, like the defense bill. It had deleted all those terminologies that were associated with the socio-political role of the military and replaced by those terminologies that reflected principles of democracy, principles of a modern professional military in the context of a democratic political system. So that was the timeline that I was trying to show you. And the third is Suharto. During the revolutionary days, during the struggle for independence, President Suharto, I think, was the highest, was at the rank of major. He was, let me see, he was the inner circle with the leadership of the military around Yogyakarta. He was with who was our Commander-in-Chief, Sudirman, during that time. I think he was ADC to Sudirman, and he rose up to the headquarters, and that when, how did he move to power in 1965-66? Because when the abortive Communist Party coup d'etat broke in 1965, he was holding the command authority. He was the commander of the Army Strategic Reserve Command. And when the Indonesian Communist Party coup d'etat broke down, and they did not prepare for any event of failure in their coup d'etat effort by the Communist Party, it was all by President Suharto, who went after these ex-members of the Communist Party. So that was General Suharto, and I think it was the 1965 counterattack from the army addressed to the former members of the Indonesian political parties that thrusted President Suharto to the center of Indonesian political power in 1965.
Well, just real quick on the national reconciliation or reconciliation thing. My impression is we are talking about two different things. What I meant is, what is the best approach to deal with those military officers who were part of the military government and at least from the view of, from the perspective of some more radical oppositional forces, deserve to be punished and purged. I don't know of a single historical case in which civilians were able to purge the military, to punish military officers successfully, when the military remained cohesive, unified, and had initiated the transition from military government to civilian government. There is not a single historical case where this attempt did not lead to disaster. And we talked about Spain this morning. And in Spain, there never ever has been some kind of retributive justice after 1975, after the end of the Franco regime. So my advice would be, concluding from the historical evidence, that new democracies may be well advised not to engage under these circumstances in approaches or projects of retributive justice. And with case to Indonesia, of course, Indonesia is a very exceptional case. There are not many military institutions or organizations that reform themselves from within.
Yes, I think I forgot. There was a question about membership of the military in the parliament. Yes, going back to the history, when the Indonesian freedom fighters saw that there was an independent sovereign Indonesian Republic, then they tried to form the national army, But actually, in reality, in de jure, it was a national army. But in de facto, the army was a political force. The army was a political force. And that is what I tried to show, that why can that happen? Because they consider one to the other as a comrade in arms. They struggled together during the struggle for independence. So when they found that they had a new republic, I can say that, okay, one school of thought would say that those who attended studies in Western Europe, mainly during that time it was the Netherlands, okay, we would adopt the parliamentary democracy. We would have multi-party system. We tried that, but there were some cautiousness towards that. But those who never went overseas and fought for independence in the hills and jungles of Indonesia, they were very much influenced by independence, by non-cooperation. In fact, some of them had high regards for Japanese nationalism as a fellow Asian nation. So the army existed as a political power, and how is that? The army can have a different say than President Sukarno. The army can challenge President Sukarno. Although that initially those leaders in the military would try to adopt civil supremacy, but almost everybody, even President Sukarno and the military, was fed up with political parties in which they did not complete or finish the mission that they were assigned to write a new constitution. The 1945 constitution actually was intended as a temporary constitution. The founding fathers said this is a temporary constitution. Why? Because the Japanese had capitulated, while the Dutch tried to come back. Then we have to finish this, and they made a proclamation of the independence in 1945. So they say that, okay, hopefully in the future, when we have more time, we would write a better constitution. They tried that, but they did not finish it. President Sukarno also became impatient, and that's why he came into a collaboration with the army to reenact the 1945 constitution. And it was there was something in the 1945 constitution which the army was trying to get, and it was that the 1945 constitution mandated for a functional group, and with that, formally and legally, the military, the army, was considered as one of the functional groups, and that opened the door for the army to have a political role, to formalize that, they asked and they were authorized to have some membership in the parliament.
It started in 1958 with 35 representatives, which forms as 12% of the membership of the legislative body. In 1967, it went up to 43. In 1968, it went up to 75. And the peak was reached in 1983, where the military and the police had 100 representatives in the parliament. After that, it went down, and in 1997, it was decreased into 38, and in 2000, with the amendment of the Constitution, the military voluntarily disbanded their representative in the legislative body, which went down to 0. Until now, the military does not have any more representative in the parliament. Right now, what we can say is, what is your idea of the future role for the TNI as a professional military in a democratic political system? It's just, I would say that it's just like any professional military in an established democracy, with the professional military, with the role of external defense under civil supremacy. That would be the end state as the objective where military reform in Indonesia was going.
I would like to ask the question. Yes, I would like to ask the question to General Wijojo. Yeah, for the transforming process, civilian government transformation is still in progress right now, and the transformation of military. How do you think Myanmar military process reform is the process status of the progress? And also, I would like to ask, my question is, transforming of military is in Myanmar context, we are involving with ethnic groups. So, transforming of military, we have to think about the ethnic group integration with the military transforming. So, from your presentation, I heard about the compensation. That's why I would like to ask, in the transforming of military in Myanmar, number 1, protocol, number 2, compensation, number 3, privilege. Those all factors are the main barrier for the transforming process of military in Myanmar or not. And also, my second question is, I would like to seek your valuable advice for the fundamental philosophy of between integration of military reforming and civil government reforming process. Thank you very much.
ကျွန်တော်မေးချင်တာတော့ပေါ့နော်ဒီပထမဒီလူကြီးမင်းပြောသွားတဲ့ဒီအင်ဒိုရဲ့ reform ဖြစ်စေပါဒီရပ်ပတ်အင်အားစုတွေရဲ့အကြောင်းပေါ့ကျွန်တော်တို့နိုင်ငံမှာကတော့ဒီစစ်ဘက်အင်အားစုတွေနဲ့ဖွဲ့စည်းပုံကိုဒီစွမ်းအားပြည့်လဲပအောင်ဒါစူးစမ်းနေတဲ့အနေအထားပေါ့အဲ့ဒီကမှဒီပထမလူကြီးမင်းပြောသွားတာဒီအင်ဒိုရဲ့ reform မှာဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ဘယ်လိုဖြစ်လဲဆိုရင်ဒီစစ်ဘက်ရဲ့ reform ပေါ်မှာစိုးရိမ်မှုမရှိအောင်အရပ်ဘက်အနေနဲ့နားချပြီးကိုတွန်းအားပေးတယ်လို့ပြောသွားပါတယ်အဲ့ကြတော့ဒီပေါ့ဒီစစ်ဘက်ကနေမှလေးစားလောက်တဲ့ဒီပေါ့ဒီအပြောင်းလဲတစ်ခုသူ့ရဲ့အပြောင်းလဲပေါ်မှာဒီတစ်ဖက်ကိုဒီစိတ်ချယုံကြည်လေးစားတဲ့တိုင်ဝမ်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ပေါ်လာအောင်ဒီအင်ဒိုလိုနိုင်ငံမျိုးမှာဆိုရင်ပေါ့ဘယ်လိုမွေးဖွားတည်ဆောက်ခဲ့တယ်လဲပေါ့အဲ့လိုအတိုင်ဝမ်တစ်ခုကိုဘယ်လို create လုပ်ပေးနိုင်ခဲ့တယ်လဲပေါ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီစစ်ဘက်ရဲ့လေးစားတဲ့ဒီအတိုင်ဝမ်တစ်ခုပေါ့နော်ဒီစစ်ဘက်ရဲ့ဒီအသွင်ကူပြောင်းတဲ့နေရာမှာစစ်ဘက်ရဲ့ဒီနောက်ကိုစုပ်သွားတဲ့သူ့ရဲ့ခြေလမ်းတွေကိုဖြစ်လာဖို့အတွက်စစ်ဘက်လေးစားတဲ့အတိုင်းဝိုင်းတစ်ခုလိုအပ်တယ်အဲ့လိုလိုအပ်တယ်ဆိုအဲ့လိုအတိုင်းဝိုင်းတစ်ခုအင်ဒိုမှာဆိုရင်ဒီဘယ်လိုတိဆောက်ပေးနိုင်ခဲ့တယ်လဲဆိုတဲ့မေးခွန်းပါဗျကျေးဇူးပါဗျ
မင်္ဂလာပါကျမကတော့ချွေချွေစိန်လပ်ပါမြို့သားလွှတ်တော်ကိုယ်စားလှယ်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခုနက Professor Ariel ရဲ့ presentation ပေါ့နော် recommendation မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒီမိုကရေစီအစိုးရကနေပြီးတော့အောင်မြင်ထိရောက်တဲ့ဒီမိုကရေစီကိုပြောင်းလဲနိုင်ဖို့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒီရပ်ဖက်လူမှုဖွဲ့စည်းတွေရဲ့နောက်တစ်ခါကျတော့ကျမတို့နိုင်ငံရေးပါတီတွေပေါ့နော်လွှတ်တော်ရဲ့အစိုးရရဲ့ကနေပြီးတော့မှထိရောက်တဲ့ institution တွေဖွဲ့စည်းတည်ထောင်ပြီးတော့မှစစ်တပ်ရဲ့ စစ်တပ်တွေပေါ့ဒါမှမဟုတ် defense ပေါ့နော်ကာကွယ်ရေးတွေကောင်းမွန်တဲ့မူဝါဒတွေပြန်ကောင်းဖို့ဆောင်ရွက်သင့်တယ်လို့ပြောတဲ့အခါမှာကျမအနေနဲ့သိချင်တာပေါ့နော်ဒီအာချမက်တော်၎င်းပေါ့တခြား Latin America မဲ့တော်၎င်းအောင်ပေါ့နော် professor ရဲ့အတွေ့အကြုံရပေါ့အဲ့လိုမျိုးဘလို့ institution ဘယ်နိုင်ငံပဲပေါ့နော်ဘလို့ institution တွေတည်ထောင်ပြီးတော့ဥမာကောင်းမွန်တဲ့မူဝါဒတွေဆွဲခဲ့လို့အောင်မြင်တဲ့ဥပမာလေးသိချင်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါနဲ့ဆက်ဆက်ပြီးတော့ဒီ Lieutenant General August ရဲ့အကြံဟောပေါ့နော်သူရဲ့အတွေ့အကြုံပေါ့အင်ဒိုနီးရှားမဲ့ကောအဲ့လိုမျိုးပေါ့နော်ပူပေါင်းဆောင်ရွက်ပြီးတော့မှအရက်ဖက်စစ်ဖက်ဆက်ဆံရေးကောင်းမွန်မှုဘလို့ဆောင်ရွက်ခဲ့တယ်နောက်တစ်ခါခုနကကျမတို့ဒီကရင်ဝင်ကြီးမေးသွားလို့ပဲကျမတို့ရှိမှာစစ်ဖက်အရက်ဖက်စစ်ဖက်ဆက်ဆံရေးဆိုကျမတို့တိုင်းရင်းသားလက်နက်ကင်ဖွဲ့တွေရှိပါတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးနဲ့ကောကျမတို့ဘလို့မျိုးဆောင်ရွက်တင်တယ်လေနောက်တစ်ခါမှာအင်ဒိုနီးရှားမှာကျမတို့အာချေပြည်နယ်မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကိုပိုင်အောင်ချုပ်ရဖို့အတွက်ဒီလိုမျိုးပေါ့နော်ဒီရပ်ဖက်စစ်ဖက်ဆိုင်တီစောက်တာရှိပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာဘလို့ institution တွေကတကယ်ကိုပဲကောင်းမွန်တဲ့ driver တွေဖြစ်ပြီးတော့ဘလို့ institution တွေကတော့အထောက်ပံ့နေကောင်းကောင်းပေးခဲ့လို့ဒီရပ်ဖက်စစ်ဖက်ဆက်ဆံရေးကောင်းမွန်ပြီးတော့ပေါ့နော်ဒီလိုမျိုးငြိမ်းချမ်းရေးရကြလေဆိုတော့သိချင်ပါတယ်အားလုံးကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
ကျွန်တော်ဥစ္စာဝင်မှာ Lieutenant General August Wigogo ရဲ့ presentation လို့ပဲအတူမေးချင်ပါတယ်သူရဲ့ challenge of TNI reform မှာကျွန်တော် political transition မှာထားရမယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ military ဒီအတွက်ပေါ့လေဘယ်လို mindset တွေကိုပြောင်းလဲအောင်ဆောင်ရွက်သင့်တယ်လဲဆိုတာလေးကိုဒီမှာပြန်လေးဖြည့်ရှင်းပေးဖို့မေးလိုပါတယ်ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
Okay, the last question for this session.
Last but not the least, I suppose. I'm trying to raise with both the general and the professor, you know, based on my experiences in India. I'm from India, very democratic country, very professional military, but the military has used internal security duties in a very, very intelligent way to ensure control over provinces where there are internal security problems. And these would have parallels in many other places of the world, Myanmar included perhaps, is that when you're trying to democratize and there are internal security issues such as in Rakhine, might be used by the military as a pretty good excuse to come back and assert some of the control that they've lost. And the very interesting thing in India is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It effectively, wherever this Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958, it was first implemented in the Naga Hills when the Naga insurgency was at its peak, has been used to negate all the positive aspects of Indian democracy. Wherever this particular legislation has been effective, Kashmir, Northeast, it has undermined the very, very, various aspects of Indian democracy for which Indians are otherwise so proud of. The point I'm trying to make here is that generally the military is trained to fight a foreign enemy. That's definitely the case in India, not to rule. Even professional militaries like the Indian Army. But whenever they have been called in the aid of civil authorities to handle serious internal security duties, they have used these legislations, everything on print, the law, to actually beef up their own powers in those provinces, and we have seen a severe negation of democracy. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, first, with regard to the question of civilian institutions and constitutional change. Often constitutional change is perceived as a condition for civil-military relations reform. I think in cases like Myanmar, it's not the condition or the starting point, it's an outcome of the process of civil-military reforms. And obviously, it's very difficult to implement certain institutions which may contribute to civilian know-how in Myanmar because the constitution is so strict regarding the regulations and rules for amendment. But talking about institutions, well, a civilian defense ministry, a truly civilian defense ministry, is obviously a necessary condition or is very important for creating over time civilian knowledge and know-how. Well, that would require, as I understand the case of Myanmar, to introduce a civilian or civilianized Ministry of Defense that would require constitutional reforms. Then second, a national defense university which is under civilian oversight is also, I think, a very important element of reform, because military officers receive their education at military academies and the National Defense University. So civilians should have a say in the development of curricula at military academies and National Defense University. But of course the thing is, this can only be an outcome of the process, not the starting point of the process. Because if you want to change, if you want to introduce civilian oversight over defense ministry and, let's say, military academies, military curriculum, defense university, this is really a very, very deep cut and change to military autonomy. And for military organizations to accept such a change, there must be either an internal reform movement, I don't know if that is the case in Myanmar, or there must be trust between civilians and civilian leaders and military officers. With regard to the question on India and generally the comment on internal security, the basic idea that military organizations train to fight international wars, external defense, interstate wars, that's a big myth. There are only very few militaries who fight international wars. India versus Pakistan, for example, Israel, the United States, Great Britain and France. Most military organizations in the past 50 years have never fought a war. They are engaged, like in Indonesia, they are engaged in internal security, counterterrorism, disaster relief, peacekeeping operations, socio-economic development. That's the reality of civil-military relations in most countries outside of India, Pakistan, Russia, the United States, and a handful of other countries. And then with how to create trust, trust emerges over time. That's the most important. That's why it's so difficult to create trust between civilians and military elites or military leaders. Trust is something that can only be produced through repetitive and continuous interaction. So trust can again only be an outcome of reforms in civil-military relations, not the condition or the starting point.
Thank you. What I want to say is not much different from the professor. Yes, what is important is to agree on the arrangement. How do you arrange between the powers and authority between the civilian authority and the military? If that has been solved and agreed upon by the civilians and by the military, you can do anything. In the sense that a military commander does not have the political authority to make political decisions, because no military commander is elected by the people. It is only the elected public official that are elected by the people, and they hold political authority. They decide when, how, and what for that they use the military for. And this, for the military who has been involved in internal politics for quite some time in the past, is very difficult to change. Very difficult to change. But this is, I think, the foundation and the basic challenge is to agree on the arrangement, and even we can use the military for anything. In democracy, there is no answer such as right or wrong. In democracy, it's only a question of legality, constitutionality, and who has the authority to make the decision. So it's not a matter of right and wrong. If the decision is maybe a wrong decision, but it comes from the right authority in the sense of democracy, that is correct. The process to come to a decision of is that really the correct solution or the wrong solution would come in the control between the legislative body and the executive. But it is, in democracy, it is a matter of procedure. So the military can be used for anything as long as it is decided by the supreme political authority, the commander-in-chief, the president. But do not let the military decide for itself what they think they should do, even if they think that it is best to the best interest of the country. And there are some theories in civil-military relations to avoid the military to slip into politics and internal politics and development, those that are outside the traditional military role of national defense, just push the military away from having been or to be involved in internal matters. Their role is on external matters, external defense, peacekeeping mission, international peacekeeping. Keep away the military from being involved into domestic, even though it's development. This used to be the mantra in 1970s with Latin American countries and also Asian developing countries, so that even the experts tried to accommodate those practices, and that became the concept of the new professionalism. But actually, the new professionalism of the military is a deviation of the professionalism of the military under civil supremacy. So keep away the military from any involvement for domestic affairs, and for compensation and privilege. Also, there is in that political theory that does not apply in Indonesia. When I hold discussions with experts about civil-military relations, what compensation do you give to the Indonesian military so that they withdrew from their socio-political role? No, there was no compensation at all, because it came initially from within the military itself. So the civilian politician does not have to appease the military and give compensation to the military. This happens mostly in Latin American countries, as what I have read. But it is not a matter of compensation, but it is a matter of how to try to moderate from a situation, from a changing situation. And for Indonesia, the change did not come in a week. The change did not come in a year. The change did not come in 10 years. As we saw also that there was a gradual politics by proxy also played by the Indonesian military. We were what Myanmar is today. Indonesian military was where Myanmar is today. Indonesian military established a political party operated by military officers. Firstly, active duty military officers, then by military retirees. That took some, let me see, around, that took place in the 80s. Before, in the 1998 and 1999, the military was withdrawn fully from their socio-political role. But there was some transition forms. The transition forms consist of, establishing a military political party operated by military officers in a gradual way. Now it has become a full political party operated by civilians with an ideology by that political party. It used to be the government political party during the New Order. Their ideology was actually, if I could say, ideology of development. Also, the gradual withdrawal from the parliament. So it took around 15 to 10 years before the full-blown military reform of 1998 and 1999 could take place. So do not dream of a sudden change, and it depends how communication can be built between the military and the civilian elites. Because after all, this is a decision that you have to make for yourself as a Myanmarese nation for the future of Myanmar. So I think there's no other alternative than for you to be able to talk to each other and to build trust between one and another. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, the retired Lieutenant General August Wijojo and also Professor Dr. Oral Crossens for your very wide-ranging insight discussion about political transition from military to civilian government. Thank you very much.